Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Rogie-Fiddler. I'm CEO of Farm Foundation and also a fifth-generation farm owner-operator from Nebraska. So I'm very passionate about the topic that we'll be covering today. Thank you to each of you for joining us for our Farm Foundation Forum today, the agricultural platforms of the candidates for President of the United States. On behalf of our entire Farm Foundation team, I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to those who are here in the room with us, as well as our online participants. We're glad to be able to return to the National Press Club to engage with you on this important topic, and are thankful for Farm Credit's support of our forums. To share just a brief bit about Farm Foundation, for those of you who might not know us, we are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating both people and ideas into action. The three levers we use are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission of building trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society. And our vision is to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. If you're interested in learning more about Farm Foundation, partnering with us, or funding our work, I invite you to reach out to explore collaboration. Before we get started, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. If you're posting on social media about this session, we ask that you please use #FarmFoundationForum. There will be an audience question and answer session after our wonderful panel discussion, and we are live streaming, so for those of you joining us online, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. We will take as many questions from the audience in person and online as time allows. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we'll send everyone who registered a link by email as soon as possible after the forum. That email will also include a link to a very brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing that survey. So now let's turn to the topic for today. With the election just 8 weeks away, we are pleased to be able to facilitate this forum to examine the farm policies of former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. As a nonpartisan organization, Farm Foundation plays such an important role in providing this opportunity to voters to learn more about the specific elements of the candidates' food and agricultural policies. The conversation will be moderated by Kristina Peterson. Kristina is an enterprise reporter in the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau. She previously covered food and agricultural policy, Congress, and the Federal Reserve. She's been at the Journal since 2009. Speaking to the Republican agricultural platform will be Ambassador Kip Tom, co-lead of the Farmers and Ranchers for Trump Coalition. He is an 8th-generation Indiana farmer and served as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture and Chief of the United States Mission to the UN agencies in Rome from 2019 to 2021. He's also the chairman of Tom Farms, LLC, an international consultant on farm production, and a Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellow. Speaking to the Democratic agricultural platform will be Rod Snyder, former senior advisor for agriculture for the Environmental Protection Agency during the Biden-Harris administration through last month. In March 2024, he was named as the director of EPA's newly established Office of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. Previously, he served as president of Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture, and has held positions as public policy director for the National Corn Growers Association and government affairs leader for CropLife America. So before I turn things over to Kristina, please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel today. And over to you.
Thank you, Sherry. We're going to start with some introductory remarks from both of our panelists. Rod, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Rod Snyder, and I just want to start by thanking the Farm Foundation for hosting this important forum. I actually just, in preparation, watched the one from 4 years ago and found it incredibly informative. The fact that they do this every cycle is so important. Certainly want to thank Ambassador Tom for his participation today. I think we will agree on some things and disagree on some things, but I have just tremendous respect for your leadership over the years and just happy to be here with you. Kristina, thank you so much for moderating this discussion. Agriculture and rural communities deserve this kind of substantive policy discussion, which is so often lacking in our current political environment. I'm here today in my personal capacity, although I am a recent alum of the Biden-Harris administration, and my career spans more than 2 decades working in agriculture policy. Perhaps most importantly, I am from a small town called Shenandoah Junction, West Virginia, population 700. My family has farmed in Jefferson County, West Virginia in various capacities since the late 1700s. The future of America's small towns, rural communities, and farming families is deeply personal to me, and I intend to spend my entire career fighting for the vitality of these kinds of places. That's why I am so proud to support Vice President Kamala Harris for President of the United States in 2024. Vice President Harris is working to build an opportunity economy where farmers, ranchers, and rural communities can thrive. This starts by ensuring that producers of all sizes have access to diverse markets, a robust safety net, a reliable workforce, an innovation pipeline, and a level playing field with competitors around the world. It's also vitally important that rural communities, where most of our food is grown, are healthy and thriving places. Over the past 4 years, through the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden and Vice President Harris have made unprecedented investments in these very places. Includes just the recent announcement about nearly $10 billion to help member-owned rural electric cooperatives provide their communities with clean, reliable, and affordable energy, the single largest investment in rural electricity since FDR, more than $50 billion to improve water infrastructure, including removing lead pipes, strengthening wastewater and drinking water systems, and addressing drought, connecting nearly 1 million rural Americans to high-speed internet through USDA's Reconnect program, and more than $4 billion to support 1,300 rural transit systems around the country. These investments are already having an impact. The USDA ERS 2023 Rural America at a Glance report shows that rural population is growing again after a decade of overall population loss. Of course, one of the most important decisions that Vice President Harris has made in the past few weeks is the selection of her running mate, Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota. This choice should be especially encouraging to agricultural stakeholders. Prior to being elected governor, Tim Walz spent 12 years in Congress, where he served 6 terms on the House Agriculture Committee and helped write 3 farm bills. His district in southern Minnesota was among the top 10 districts for value of ag commodities in the entire country. This is a leader who is deeply familiar with rural America and who gained a reputation for working across party lines to support farmers in Minnesota and across the country. I suspect if he wasn't so busy, he could do a better job at this conversation than me if he was available this afternoon. Together, Vice President Harris and Governor Walz represents a team that is ready to fight for farmers, ranchers, and rural communities on day one. By contrast, the 4 years of the Trump presidency was defined by chaos and uncertainty for the farm economy, and the outlook for a second term would be even more severe. National Corn Growers' former CEO, John Doggett, wrote in AgriPulse just last week, "There are things former President Trump has said that should raise significant concerns for anyone making a living in agriculture. If enacted, the policies he says he supports would make life more uncertain for those who work to put food on our tables." And I could not agree more with John. This election is a choice between certainty and chaos for farmers and ranchers across the country. During his prior term, Trump's trade war cost American farmers $29 billion in lost exports in 2018 and 19 alone, while undermining markets that took decades for our farmers to build. In his most recent proposal of 10 to 20% across-the-board tariffs for all imported products would lead to further loss of global market share for U.S. agriculture, not to mention rapid inflation for consumers. In terms of farm labor, a second Trump term would be equally devastating. Roughly 70% of ag workers in the United States are foreign-born, and nearly half of those are undocumented. Trump is promising mass deportation on an unprecedented scale without any consideration for our country's ag system, food prices, or least of all, the human toll. There are thoughtful, bipartisan proposals in Congress to address ag workforce challenges and legal pathways. However, former President Trump would prefer to throw our country's farms and food system into chaos rather than forge a meaningful solution to the decades-long problem. For our friends in the corn and soybean space, our corn and soy farmers, biofuels have become an important domestic market. And yet the Trump administration left the renewable fuels standard in disarray. Trump's EPA issued handouts to oil refineries that undercut renewable fuel production by nearly 4 billion gallons during his time in office. He departed the White House in 2021 without setting any mandatory volumes for ethanol or biodiesel that year. More uncertainty, more chaos. Lastly, President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord, joining only Iran, Libya, and Yemen as nations outside of the historic international agreement. And he dismantled major climate initiatives across the federal government. By contrast, the Biden-Harris administration has invested heavily in voluntary, farmer-led climate and sustainability initiatives that are helping position America's farmers and ranchers as leaders in the low-carbon economy, while building the long-term resiliency of our agricultural sector. In closing, I think it's important to acknowledge that the farm economy currently is experiencing a down cycle, which all of us should be concerned about. However, in terms of policies being advanced by Donald Trump, in my opinion, the cure is worse than the disease. I am eager for the leadership of Vice President Harris and Governor Walz, who will fight tirelessly for our farmers, ranchers, and rural communities while building an opportunity economy that works for all Americans. Again, I just want to thank the Farm Foundation for hosting this important conversation, and I look forward to the questions over the next couple of hours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sherry, thank you so much for that great introduction, but more importantly, I want to say thank you for the Farm Foundation for taking the leadership to establish this event, bringing in people across the ag and food spectrum to have a dialogue, have a discussion here today, and hopefully afterwards as well. But it's the farmers, it's the ranchers, it's the policymakers, it's those that reside in Congress, and those involved all throughout the supply chain, which makes this dialogue so much more important. You know, we've gotten away from this, but I remember when President Eisenhower made a comment, farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from the field. And I think when you look at agriculture today and we look at our policymakers, I think we see so much policy in Washington that's enacted that is far from what we need in rural America. Far from what we need to make sure that we're a reliable source of a strong economy and an agricultural ecosystem. Well, I'll start out by saying I have no formal platform from the Trump campaign for 2024 on agriculture, but I can talk about his record in the past and the successes he had. An example would be trade. You know, we had some trade wars with China. Soon afterwards, we had the 301 tariffs, which are still in place today under the Biden-Harris administration. We know that soon after phase one was installed with the Chinese, we saw nearly a $26 to $38 billion increase in trade, and we signed an $80 billion trade deal with China at the same time. And we've done over 50 trade deals with China during the Trump administration. I think Donald Trump is clearly the leader in making sure that we have a strong ag economy and making sure we can continue to export our excess here in this country. I'm going to share my personal views in a little bit, but I'll start out, who am I? I haven't been involved in Washington much. I think my first trip here was in 2014. I've been a farmer my entire life, 50 years of it, in fact. Grew up on a farm in Leesburg, Indiana, a town of 400, close to the size of the town you came from. But our family came into this country in the late 1600s. They fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought in the Civil War, both world wars, and then they made their way to Indiana, where we've been since 1837. They lived through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and they survived. They were also part of that system where we started mechanized agriculture, and then we had the Green Revolution, we had genetics come along, we had the digital revolution, we had crop care products, increasing that productivity. And I talk about this productivity a lot because it really sets in my mind when I listened to my father talk before he passed about 2.5 years ago. We went to the farm where he first walked in the furrow behind his father, behind horses, and looked at that field, and we talked about life, talked about farming. And it's the same field that I went to as a child and walked behind my father as he laid that first furrow. Dad looked at me and said, when I was a boy, this field yielded 30 bushel per acre. What did it yield this year? I said 240. Eightfold increase. Imagine the innovation that started in the United States that allowed this to happen. We need to untether that innovation once again. We cannot let Washington, D.C. get in the way. We cannot let government get in the way of bringing new innovations to the marketplace. So I'm fortunate. I've lived the American dream. My parents raised 5 children. We started out with 120 acres. We were in 4-H, FFA, went to church, worked in the community. I lived the American dream. We invested, we worked hard, we took risk. And that's not uncommon throughout agriculture. I could take you across the Midwest, the West Coast or the East Coast, anywhere in the country, and you can find people that live that American dream. So my message to you today is this. Let's make sure that we set policy in place. Let's make sure we have a dialogue that allows the American dream to stay alive, because it's got us where we are today. Which is why I got involved with the Farmers and Ranchers for Trump 47 Coalition. We looked at the risk that was being posed upon us by the Biden-Harris administration, and now the Harris-Walz administration becomes a reality. You know, one of the biggest significant issues I see us being faced with is probably death tax. What is being proposed today will nearly double the amount of farmers and ranchers that will have to pay inheritance taxes, money they've already paid taxes on, and now when they transition that to the next generation, will continue to pay taxes. It could be the most undermining issue, taking away the farms and the ranches as we know them today, having to sell off assets to continue their family legacy of producing food, fiber, and energy. I look at the regulatory issues in our country. Under the Biden-Harris administration, they've created almost $1.67 trillion of new regulations. That's not only costing industries, this is costing farmers, this is costing the American consumer. That's why we see the 30% inflation at the grocery store today. Kamala Harris needs to look no further for price gouging than to look in the mirror at herself. And like I said, under the Trump administration, he had nearly 50 trade deals, but we don't talk about that. They got the work done. Ambassador Dowd, Mr. Lighthizer, Secretary Lighthizer went to work and fixed a lot of these issues that came from the prior administration. They left agriculture in good shape when they left their offices back in January of 2020. They left trade deals that were working well for our country. Again, I'll say this, the 301 trade issues are still there today under the Harris administration. They still keep those tariffs in place, and we need to remember that. But we've had no trade deals under the Harris administration, none. And that's why we see a decline in our export sales of nearly $42.5 billion this next year. We were on an increase until Donald Trump left office, and now we're seeing a decline. Now we're seeing a decline in farmers' income. Farm Bureau came out this past week, and they lowered their expectations on farm income to almost 50% from between 2022 and 2024. Now that's a little different than the ERS document or numbers that came out that looked more broadly. But if you look at Midwest agriculture, you look at some of our livestock sectors, they're paying the price today for not having those trade agreements in place. So how do we ensure that American dream becomes a reality into the future, continue on for all of us? We need to have a national agriculture strategy. And this comes from the private sector and the public sector working together to make sure that we have this strategy in place so we can deal with some of the counter conflicts that we have around the world, whether it's China, places where China resides, such as in Africa. We need this strategy. We need a unified advocacy agenda. Let's face it, we've disconnected between urban and rural divide to the point where we don't talk anymore. People don't know where their food comes from. They don't understand. And now they're pointing their finger at us and saying we're the cause of food price inflation. So I think we really need to have that discussion. We need to enhance and expand infrastructure. When I talk to some of the seed breeders, people in the seed industry, and think that we're going to double the yield of corn in the next 20, 25 years, all the more reason we need, obviously, more biofuel production. But at the same time, think of what our ports look like. Think about what our rail lines look like, our roads. All the more reason we need to invest in infrastructure if we're going to maintain a strategic edge against other nations. And we need to reduce our reliance on foreign inputs. You know, nearly 70% of the crop care products that we use in the United States are produced abroad, much in India, but primarily in China. Imagine if they hit the kill switch. Imagine if we couldn't have the products that we need to make sure that we can fight back against the weeds, insects, and diseases that we have in our crops, or the pharmaceutical or the drugs that we need for our livestock to keep them healthy. They hit that kill switch, productivity goes down, food prices go up, and as people say oftentimes, all societies are only 3 meals from chaos. We need to incentivize careers for young people in agriculture. We need to make sure that we're attracting the right talent back into the industry to play a role in feeding that growing world, especially as we march towards that population of 9.5 or 10 billion people. And we need to ensure the availability of guest workers. I listened to you, Rod, and what you had to say there. There are programs, but we need to enforce legal immigration. There's a system in place. I've met with some poultry producers. I've met with some other packing houses in the last month, and I can tell you, listening to them, talking to them, and seeing their records, they have legal migrants. So I'm not worried about them being raided and losing their workforce. But we do have an illegal immigration problem that needs to be solved. We also need better risk management tools. When we look at agriculture, we have the crop insurance that we have today, but it could be fortified. It could be built up to provide more risk to more crops, whether you're in California or you're in Indiana, any place across the country. So there's a lot of things we need to get done, but it's the only way it's going to happen is if groups like this work together and have a conversation and know that we're not always going to agree. But we need to make sure that people have that second opportunity in their family to live the American dream. President Trump made the comment this past week. He wants to invest in new and modern agriculture techniques. That's a really great sign to hear that from the president, that he's willing to invest in new modern techniques and to support innovation in our country. I think we're losing our focus on innovation. Oftentimes I hear this comment, we have people in the room that are probably involved in the chemistry industry, that are producing products that can be sold across the United States and around the world. It's that innovation, it's that work that they do to produce that product that soon gets copied by the Chinese, then they're producing it, or the EU is regulating it. We need to make sure that we continue the pathway to be the innovators in the world in leading that charge. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have collapsing farm incomes. We've got a growing trade deficit. We have the tax policies, which are a threat to our industry. We have the overreach of some agencies that should be working to help us bring these new innovations to market, yet they slow us down. I look at the Endangered Species Act. Even though Rod worked on it, he got handed this policy and had to work with it, but the reality is it's going to be something for farmers that we're not prepared for. We weren't a part of that conversation. We should be. That's why we're here today. You heard me talk about food price caps. There is no monopoly in the food system, none at all. When you look at the grocery manufacturers, you look at those in retail, the reality is a lot of them are high volume, low margin. They continue to innovate to be competitive with each other. And then if you look all the way up and down the food supply chain, there is no monopoly. And then we have the increased food prices to the American consumer and those around the world. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to our moderator. We really do have some good things to talk about here, by the way. But I'm looking forward to the conversations, and I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much for that. I promise we are going to come back to trade because that seemed very interesting. But we did think we would start off with a topic that I know a lot of people in this room are following very closely, which is the Farm Bill. We are nearing the end of a one-year extension of the most recent 5-year Farm Bill. And I wanted to ask you each what your top priorities are looking ahead to negotiations for either an extension or a new 5-year farm bill, and when your best guess is of when that might materialize.
I'm happy to start. So I'll begin by saying that I stopped betting on the timing of the Farm Bill a while ago. I shouldn't speculate, but you know, in all seriousness, American farmers, the whole ag sector, critically needs certainty, and so just urge Congress to move as expeditiously as possible to get this done. And I think the key to success in past farm bills for many, many, many years has been holding together that traditional partnership, the coalition between farm production programs and nutrition programs. And to me, you know, you can talk about all the other priorities that sort of underlie that, but making sure that both of these pieces move together has been critical to success. The House, the Farm Bill that was passed by the House Ag Committee, mostly along partisan lines, really did undercut SNAP and nutrition programs in a significant way. And so should not be, in my opinion, the starting point for negotiation. We have a framework that the Senate Ag Committee has put on the table. We've got the House bill. We've got proposals out there. We just need folks to come together earnestly and begin negotiating in a way that I think the American farmer deserves. If we're not going to make that September 30th deadline, we should be talking about an extension. But in my opinion, the key thing is how do we hold together that traditional partnership that has always led to success.
You know, I'm going to side with Rod on this. I can't predict a date that it's going to be signed or we're going to have a farm bill in front of us. But the reality is, I think the House, G.T. Thompson's done a remarkable job of putting together a bipartisan bill that's ready to move forward. It's in the Senate where it's been slowed down, but we all know that. But the reality is it takes leadership, and it starts at the top. And we need to have a president that says, get this done. And Debbie Stabenow, Senator Stabenow needs to get back at the table, get in those negotiations, and get something done. When you look at a farm bill, it's going to be a $1.5 trillion bill over 5 years. And the food provisions or the SNAP provisions within it is almost 83% of that total cost. I can't believe there isn't some room to negotiate a little bit when you consider the fraud that takes place inside of SNAP. I mean, this is a program that's grown from, in 2000, it was about $15 billion. This last year was about $110 billion. And then we see instances around the country where it's been abused. The most recent one was this past week. A subpoena was delivered to Vice Presidential candidate Waltz on a $250 million fraud case in Minnesota, which he was in the reporting lines. 80 people have been charged. 18 have been convicted. And this is a side of fraud that takes place with it. But I'm going to say this. I'm very much of a supporter to make sure that we can help that family that is food insecure, that's maybe fallen on tough times. I want to make sure our seniors retire with dignity, and with our increases in food inflation right now, that's really difficult for them. So I'm compassionate about it. I want to do what's right. But there's room to bring in and reel in the fraud that takes place there. In terms of the Farm Bill, President Trump was the first one to get a farm bill done on time since 1993, 30-some years ago. I think that's a sign of leadership. He brought the folks in, let's figure this out, let's come to a conclusion. It may not be perfect, but let's get it done. So I say it comes back to leadership. But again, I think we need to see some changes in reference pricing. We need to probably see some base acre changes that have occurred over years. We haven't kept it relevant to the time we're in today. But I say clean up SNAP, try to find some provisions over here to assure that farmers have the ability to withstand any trade issues that come in front of us, and reference pricing would do that. I think we need to make sure that this farm bill is looking at our loss in trade over the past 3.5 years here under the Biden-Harris administration. So whether it gets done this fall, I can say if there's a Trump administration, which I predict there will be come in January, we'll have a bill pretty soon afterwards.
It's obviously a huge piece of legislation, so let's take a couple bites at this. SNAP is obviously where a lot of the partisan controversy centers. Are there any particular changes in the SNAP program that you would advocate for, from sort of larger scale changes to even just collecting some of the data around what is bought with SNAP benefits?
Well, let me just start. I'll quickly respond to something that Kip said, which is that if there are problems, if people are breaking the rules, there are mechanisms to enforce those. That's actually part of the system. It's part of the process. That is not necessarily an argument for undercutting the entire funding of the program, right? I would say that let's first talking about values for Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. Back in 2022, the Biden-Harris White House convened the first conference on hunger, nutrition, and health in more than 50 years to bring stakeholders from all across the country to the table to talk about these really critical issues, including things like the future of SNAP. The Biden-Harris administration also just established a nationwide summer EBT program, the first major investment in a decade in a new program to make sure that kids who are home from school in the summer and are food insecure have access to meals during the summer months. That's about values. Governor Walz in Minnesota signed legislation just a couple of years ago that provided universal breakfast and lunch for children in public schools in Minnesota because, as he says it, kids learn better when their bellies are full. Those are about values. Those are the kinds of things that you could see from the Harris-Walz administration in terms of the priorities around these programs. I'll just say there are already some specific rules in place for what you can and can't buy for SNAP. I think it's just critically important that A, we continue the investment, B, let's make sure we're not stigmatizing this program, let's make sure that folks have access to it and they can feel they can go to the grocery store and buy what they need and not put barriers in place, and I think that's the type of priorities that you would see from a President Harris.
Well, I worked at the UN organizations in Rome. One of our mandates was obviously food security around the world, dealing with the World Food Program and FAO to create resilience and capacity in food systems. I've seen hunger at its worst, and it's heart-wrenching. When I come back to the United States and I see those that are in such dire need of that food assistance, but yet they don't have access to it because we have fraud taking place in other places, I realize there's mechanisms to manage this, but I'm telling you the mechanism's broken. Because we're not, you can look at different reports from different states around the country and see where that food assistance isn't getting always to the right people. And that's where I say I think the system needs cleaned up, period. When I think about some money that's been spent, Secretary Vilsack back a few years ago, unilaterally by himself, put in almost $238 billion into the Thrifty Food Plan. I'm not sure that kind of money is worth, should be allowed for one person to make that decision to get that done from this Commodity Credit Corporation. This should have had congressional oversight. Now again, I want to stress, I want to make sure that any person that is hungry and in dire straits in the United States and a need for food, we address their need. But what I'm saying is the system needs cleaned up.
Rod, did you want to respond on the Thrifty Food Plan at all?
Well, I'll just mention that the 2018 Farm Bill directed USDA to make updates to the Thrifty Food Plan. That was at the bipartisan direction from Congress in the Farm Bill that you mentioned a few minutes ago, that USDA make those changes, because if you look at the fact that the Thrifty Food Plan had not been updated in 50 years in terms of the way you calculate that equation, it's not just about food cost inflation, it's also about dietary guidelines. It's about the science around what kids and families should be eating. It's about looking at consumption patterns. And so Congress directed USDA to make those changes. At the end of the day, the statistic I have is the benefit increase averages to $1.19 per day per person that's on SNAP. So we're not talking about an exorbitant amount of money here from a it comes down to a participant perspective. And those were changes that Congress directed USDA to undertake. I think they were long overdue, and in many respects they were modest.
You mentioned the universal free school meals that Governor Walz has discussed. That's something that a handful of states have been looking at in recent years. Is that something that you think the next administration should push at a federal level? There's been some resistance in Congress to this idea. I think there's some concerns that more affluent kids don't need that paid for on their behalf.
It's worthy of a debate for sure. I don't think that Vice President Harris has specific policy on this question, so I don't want to speculate, except for to say that I think in states where this program has been adopted, they're certainly seeing some success. It cuts down on the administrative costs around school lunches and breakfasts, and it's certainly worth the conversation. Beyond that, I can't say exactly where Vice President Harris would be in terms of federal policy.
Yeah, my feelings on it, yes, the children that are in need, that need to have that nutrition when they get to school in the morning. I mean, we've all grew up in a rural area. Hop on the bus and you could tell the kids, and you knew that they didn't have anything for breakfast. They suffered throughout the day in their learning ability. But those of us that could afford it, I don't think we should be getting free lunch. I want to make sure that this is reserved for those that are truly in need. But the dietary guidelines really need to have probably another purview again. I don't see any reason why we don't have whole milk as a part of that meal for that child when he comes into school in the morning, or at noon at the same time, or better yet, 3 times a day. I think there's a lot of things we could do with the guidelines to change them to make sure we're meeting nutritional needs. You know, part of your question earlier was that do we need to manage or have some oversight on what people are really buying with their SNAP dollars? And there's no question in my mind, ultra-processed foods is something that we probably shouldn't be buying. I mean, let's face it, we all go to grocery stores. You can see that there's more fruits and vegetables available to us than it's ever been before because of supply chain improvement. There's no reason why they aren't putting more of that in their diet. And I listen to people talk about obesity, type 2 diabetes, and issues like that. I think our problem is lifestyle and convenience. I mean, I think right now the average household wants to spend 8 or 9 minutes making a meal for a family at the end of the day. Sometimes it's less than that, obviously, but it comes down to just consuming ultra-processed food, and then that child sits down on a couch and gets on his phone or his computer and sits around. I don't know about you two, but when we got done with dinner, we had something to do. It was a farm chore or something. We were lean. We may not ate the healthiest all the time, but we got out and did something. We burnt calories. And today, I think, people want to blame the food system oftentimes, but the reality is we need to make some lifestyle changes too, get more active in our lives.
If we could explore some of the other pieces of the Farm Bill, crop insurance is a priority among lots of ag groups, but there is some opposition on both the right and the left to this. Where do you each stand on the idea of crop insurance? Do you think it needs to be bolstered further or winnowed down a bit? Kip?
Yeah, so obviously a farmer, so I take out crop insurance, like 80% I think of the rest of the farmers in the country. They cover a lot of crops. You look at the amount of claims against that since it's been started, they continue to decline. Farmers' practices continue to improve because obviously you don't want to have that claim. I would rather not ever get a crop insurance check in the mail. I'd rather pay the premium, know I got the assurance that someone is standing behind us if we need them. Now, is it important to rural America? Is it important to our country? Absolutely. If you're somebody that works at the GM plant, or you're somebody that works at John Deere, or you're a supply chain partner producing the seed or chemistries, it gives you the surety. And if you're the bank, it gives you the bank the courage to loan to maybe that young producer that would never get a loan if he didn't have access to that crop insurance. So whether you're a young producer, whether you're a mature, larger operation, crop insurance is critical to us. Can it be fine-tuned and changed? Absolutely. I've got some ideas on that, but not for this dialogue, but there's ways we can do this to, I think, shore it up even better.
This is probably an area where Kip and I have strong agreement. I think the crop insurance system in the United States has been a tremendous success. You said it already, but ag security and food security is national security, and this tool I think is one of the most important ways in which we make sure that our farmers can stay in business through the good years and the bad years. You're right, there has been opposition from maybe the left and the right flank on this issue, and I think that's largely misplaced. This is a critical tool. When I talk to farmers, this is one of the most important pieces, I think, of the Farm Bill now when it comes to the farm safety net. I promise I'm not going to invoke Project 2025 all afternoon, but I'm going to say it one time, which is that there are really powerful voices on the right-hand side. Some of them have relationships to former President Trump, who have called for the decimation of the farm safety net, including crop insurance, removing subsidies. That was, it's a 900-page document. don't have to read the whole thing, but look up the ag provisions, and it's really concerning. And so we're just going to make sure that there's a bipartisan coalition that is in place to make sure that these programs are preserved and strengthened going forward.
Let's move to a topic where there may be a little less agreement, which is trade. You kind of touched on some of this in your intro remarks, but if we could go a little bit deeper into former President Trump's proposed tariffs and what impact do you think that would specifically have on farmers? Obviously, in the previous administration, there was some economic relief provided to farmers in the aftermath of some of these trade policies. Do you think we would see a repeat of that? Would that be necessary? Maybe, Kip, we can start with you.
Certainly. So, yeah, I mean, you say, why do we need to do this? Well, when you look at the balance sheet, you look at where, and I'm going to round numbers, but let's say we're importing $500 billion worth of goods from China, and we're only exporting them 350, and that number continues to decline. We continue to see our manufacturing sector move out of this country and go other places. China is in particular in producing products that are highly subsidized back in the United States. So the reality is, yes, there will be those sanctions or those tariffs will be out there, but there's no question Trump wants to deal with them. He took care of us before when he did it originally, and then he'll take care of us this time too. But look, he did 50-some trade deals. And like I said, soon after the tariffs were imposed on China, they did a phase one agreement, almost grew our trade $80 billion over a number of 2 years. We also created more deals with Mexico, Canada, and Japan. Nearly half of our exports go to those 4 countries. We grew theirs. We were in Malaysia and other places around the world. So Trump is probably one of the most pro-trade presidents we've had, and I continue to see him being that in the future. He wants to do what's best for Americans. And if we can produce more and export more, it'd be better for us. And his pathway to get there is much different than I know the Biden-Harris administration, but they've had 4 years to try, and they haven't got it done. And it's time for Trump to be elected to make sure we get it done.
Rod?
Well, this is certainly one of the areas where I think it's probably the strongest sort of disagreement or difference in terms of approach. So if we go back to the prior Trump administration, as I said in my opening statement, those tariffs and the retaliatory actions from China resulted in $29 billion in lost export revenue. And we, the taxpayer, essentially had to make up that ground and paper over that. When I talk to most farmers across the country, they want to make their living from the markets, not from subsidies or checks from the government. And so there has to be a better way. Then, just last week, when Trump was in New York talking about his tariff plan going forward, it's far more stark than what we saw the last time around, 10 to 20% across the board for imported products and up to 60% tariffs on China. There's no question the type of retaliatory behavior that would come from other countries in terms of market access for American farmers if that type of plan was put in place. I talked to an expert over the weekend who said that the impacts of that could make the 1980s farm crisis look like a picnic in terms of the way that the markets could dry up overnight because of those tariffs. We also know that farmers are most exposed because, as was already pointed out, farmers are purchasing inputs and other things from overseas, and the prices of those go up under these types of scenarios, and their markets dry up. So you have higher inputs and you have fewer markets. That is not a sustainable outcome. And we simply, I just think it's bad news, and I think a lot of economists would significantly agree with that. Now, I do want to say the Biden-Harris administration has been working on trade over the last few years. Increased ethanol exports to Japan, open potato trade with Mexico, worked with India to get retaliatory tariffs removed on a number of specialty crops, and not to forget the $1.2 billion regional ag promotion program that was launched last year to help with developing markets, looking at parts of the world that are growing, that their economies are growing, there's more mouths to feed, perhaps it's Latin America, Africa. We need to diversify our export markets as well. Certainly love our friends in Canada, Mexico, and the EU, but we've got to diversify these markets to make sure that farmers are able to play around the whole world. But it cannot start from a position of 10 to 20% universal tariffs. And let me just say the other obvious thing, which is that the American consumer pays for that. Some NGOs are estimating it's $4,000 per family increased cost because of that type of proposal. So I think it's bad news for farmers, it's bad news for the public, and I just think it's unsustainable.
Can I jump in for just a second? So it's really, I mean, you can look at the charts, and the charts don't lie, the data doesn't lie, but if you can see during the Trump administration, our exports continue to grow the entire time. It was not till shortly thereafter, in the same, the 301s were still in place, it started to decline. I'm not aware of any trade deals that happened under the Biden-Harris administration. They've had 4 years, and by the way, we're almost to a 1980s farm crisis right now under the Biden-Harris administration. We got increasing interest rates, we got input costs are high, you got farmers that are probably over-leveraged, set on a number of dealing with bank boards all the time. I know that there's farmers that are in dire straits right now, stress. So we could head that direction really quickly if we don't get back in and get the trade done. But again, read the book, The Art of the Deal. He may come out and have these comments, and people may be fearful of him. But the reality is he'll get the deal done, and he'll make the trade happen.
$23 billion in market facilitation payments from USDA during the Trump administration. I mean, the data speaks for itself that the American taxpayer had to subsidize these policies, and it will happen again, and I think in a worse way.
I wanted to focus just on China for a minute. There's bipartisan concern on Capitol Hill and in state legislatures about Chinese ownership of U.S. farmland, foreign ownership of U.S. farmland in general. Do you think there need to be further restrictions put in place around that?
I think for any of our foreign adversaries, but in particular China. I mean, we know that they always have this comment, win-win, hand in hand, but the reality is they come to the United States, we need to realize they're not going to play by our rules. It doesn't matter whether it's their manufacturing of crop pesticides, which I said they could throw the switch at any one time. It's what they've tried to do in the United States, stealing our IP. This is why this is all on the table when we start talking trade. They're stealing our IP, they've stole our seed genetics. They continue to want to expand in the United States. They had a company called Fufang was wanting to build a site up in North Dakota, I believe it was, by a military base. That got stopped. They came to Indiana, tried to build one at Kingsbury, Indiana. That got stopped. We need something to keep them from investing anywhere in the United States because they will find creative means to collect data and do anything against the United States. We need to understand China is our largest existential threat. So when we talk trade, remember that's on the table too. And we need to understand that they have a lot of control today that we need to have and harness.
So I'll perhaps more agreement on this than disagreement in that, first of all, I'll say I'm not sure that the Harris-Walz campaign has specific policy yet on foreign ownership of farmland. I know that conversation is playing out at the state level across the country right now. I think it's a valid discussion to say, particularly perhaps land that's next to sensitive facilities or sites like military bases. We should probably be taking a look at that. And totally agree on the intellectual property conversation. We certainly need to be enforcing these things to make sure that American innovation can lead the day. I've had conversations with startup companies in my prior role, very worried about some of these issues with China. And so these are real things. They're certainly worth a conversation.
Shifting gears a little bit, Vice President Harris has proposed policies that would prevent price gouging in response to Americans' persistent concerns about inflation and the price of food specifically. How would that kind of plan affect not only consumers, but also producers of the food?
Well, let me start on this one since it's my candidate's proposal, I guess.
Yeah.
So let me start by making one point of clarification that I've heard just since in the last week, really. And it's the fact that farmers are not the cause of food inflation. Just want to be really clear up front. USDA estimates that American farmers receive less than 15 cents in every dollar for domestically produced food, and that should be a concern for all of us. But farmers are not the reason for food price inflation. And so Vice President Harris's policy is really getting at the heart of this, sort of anti-competitive concerns and issues that are coming from some of the largest companies in the world when it comes to price gouging. I also want to say, I know you said food price caps in the opening statement. That's actually not what she's proposing. What Vice President Harris is proposing, it's sort of three prongs. First, advancing the first ever federal ban on price gouging on food and groceries. There are states that already do this, so it's not novel. It just hasn't been done at a federal level. And this is especially in response to crises like the pandemic, where there are companies that have been on the record, have been caught red-handed, taking advantage of the situation to raise prices. This is not hypothetical. This has happened. Secondly, setting clear rules of the road to make sure that big corporations can't unfairly exploit consumers, and making sure that there are real penalties behind that. And then lastly, securing new authority for the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general to investigate and impose these penalties for those companies that break the law. So we're not talking about food price caps. We're certainly not talking about things that would penalize farmers. We're talking about companies that have demonstrated that they're willing to break the law in the event of a crisis in a way that disadvantages the American consumer. And I think that is an overdue conversation, and it certainly needs to be part of where we're going forward, and certainly Vice President Harris will make this a priority.
Yeah, so we know during the Biden-Harris administration, we've seen food prices go up roughly 25 to 30%. And let's remember, energy plays a role here too. And the cost of energy and the way we move products around the country, the packaging, labor forces went up. But I come back to this. We want to provide a safe, affordable, nutritious source of food for American consumers. We've seen it go up nearly 30%, 25 to 30%, depends who you listen to and what's in the basket. It's the $1.67 trillion of regulations being imposed upon those that are moving food around the country, those processing foods, anyone in the ag supply chain. That's a real burden for everybody. But then we haven't even begun to see what we're going to see in food price inflation if the Biden-Harris administration's green agenda goes forward. There's going to be a cost to all this. If you want to start capturing carbon and pay someone for the carbon, that food company is going to pass that on. Who pays it then? It's going to go on to the consumer. And this is where, whether it's producing your electricity from solar, wind, whatever it may be, maybe it's something that deals they want to enact in terms of mandates and the way we operate our farms, that's all going to come back into the cost of food inflation. So Kamala Harris needs nowhere else except look in the mirror at herself, and she can find the culprit who's in charge of food price inflation.
And Kip, what would former President Trump suggest for bringing down food prices?
Well, of course, you open up innovation. If we really think there's collusion between our food processors, and there's been a lot of consolidation over the years. There's no question about that. But if you look at their stock portfolio or their stock valuation pre-COVID, and you look at it today, it hasn't moved with the market. They haven't been able to participate in that move in the market. That's because it's highly competitive, it's high volume, low margin, and they got to continually innovate to make sure that they're bringing something that the consumer wants out there. Am I against highly processed foods and everything goes with that? Of course I am. But the reality is when you get down to it, the processed foods and everything that goes with it, a lot of this is driven by policy from the Biden-Harris administration due to regulations. Under Trump, he reduced regulations about $100 billion a year for a few years. When he went down here to the EPA, he told the administrator at that time, he says, for every one regulation you want to bring on, you got to get rid of two. That's because we continue to come up with new regs, new policies that it's a cost that's going to be handed on the consumer. I've seen food price inflation in Europe. I've seen it across the developing world. It all comes from governments that want to control things. And the result will be empty shelves is what will happen.
The one thing I'll agree with there is that food price inflation has been happening across the world. This is not unique to the United States, and it began under the Trump administration because of something we all saw with our eyes, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Those created supply chain challenges that started this domino effect that led to food price inflation. More work needs to be done, but the good news is inflation right now is at the lowest, food inflation is at the lowest level it's been in 3 years, which means we're moving things in the right direction. But we still have to deal with bad actors and those, and you mentioned it, some of the concentration in the markets. That has to be dealt with going forward to make sure that consumers have choice and to make sure that they're not being taken advantage of. And I think it's a practical proposal from the Vice President.
Kip, you mentioned the green programs. What role do you think climate and sustainability issues would play in the next administration? The USDA has talked a lot about climate smart projects. Do you think consumers would be willing to pay more for products labeled climate smart?
Listen, as a farmer, we don't get caught up in gimmicks, cute names, anything like that. We just want to go out and produce a crop. And if anyone's the true environmentalist and wants to push sustainability, it's the American farmer and rancher. You know, as I said, I'm 7th generation. My children are 8th, and of course I have the grandkids, the 9th coming on. There is no one more concerned about taking care of that land than the family legacy to make sure that takes place. I'll be damned if I think the government, someone sitting in a cubicle, should be able to tell us how we need to farm and how to be climate smart. You know, we've made a lot of steps over the years. You know, farmers have moved to using less chemistries, less fertilizer, they no-till. We've cleaned up our creeks, rivers, and streams and oceans. I don't think this is any role the government needs to be playing in. I think it's up to us as farmers to do this. Us in the private sector. If somebody in the private sector wants to pay for some climate smart practice, let that be an agreement. Let it be a carrot between the producer and the end user, if they can capture the market value that way. But I don't think this is something that the government can do and do well. Mitch Daniels used to be governor in Indiana, and at one time he said, never ask the government to do something that the private sector can do less expensively and better. And this is a case.
So totally agree that American farmers have made tremendous progress on environmental and conservation issues over the years. The data speaks for itself. We have less soil erosion. We have improved water quality. We have investment in habitat, et cetera. In part, that's because of investments from USDA and NRCS over a century coming alongside the American farmer to work together to advance these shared goals. And some of these things are just a matter of public good, and that should not all be borne by the farmer. That's the importance of these Title II conservation programs. What we're seeing in terms of climate smart agriculture is just building on the success, I believe, of the last 100 years by making sure that carbon and climate is part of that conversation. This is good news for American farmers because there is an appetite, both in the US and globally, for these kinds of new low-carbon markets. If you look at, as the private sector is willing to invest in some of these things and come alongside and buy low-carbon commodities. We're looking at new markets like sustainable aviation fuel, where reduced carbon renewable fuels that can meet the needs of some of these airlines. We should not leave the American ag sector to fend for itself. And the climate smart commodities programs that the Biden-Harris administration put in place have been a way to begin to accelerate those goals. And the demand is really incredible. When the USDA put out the Climate Smart Partnerships Program, there were 1,500 proposals that came in, and there was only enough funding for 140. That means that across the country, farmers want to do these. This is not about regulatory. This is about voluntary incentive-based programs that can meet this market demand. My concern with the second Trump administration is what he did the last time, which is pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, did not allow USDA or other federal agencies to work on these programs and priorities, and at the end of the day, U.S. agriculture goes to the back of the line in terms of clean technology development, renewable energy, the low carbon economy. We end up lagging behind the rest of the world because we're unwilling to be a part of that conversation. And Vice President Harris will make sure that we're at the table for that.
I think actually we're ahead of the world right today without the government's intervention on this. I think we spent nearly $6 billion, am I wrong, at $5 or $6 billion on the climate smart agriculture? 3? I heard they dug in deeper behind the couch and found a little more money. But anyway, whatever, $3 billion, $5 billion, $6 billion. The reality is I don't think any of this has made it to the farm gate. I don't think it's made it to the farm gate.
I disagree.
It's the NGOs, and I think it's been spread around. I haven't seen action from it. Again, I come back. This is something the private sector should be doing. I've followed a few of these grants and where they went and what they've been doing with them. I don't see anything tangible that's going to come out of there to make a difference. Does that mean we shouldn't do some of the climate smart agriculture? Yes, but leave it up to the private sector to do it.
Rod, I just wanted to ask, you had mentioned some of these voluntary programs that farmers do in conjunction with USDA. Do you think that a Harris-Walz administration would want to do any sort of mandatory programs, or is keeping this voluntary the way to go?
I think the voluntary programs have been a tremendous success story, and Governor Walz, when he was on the House Ag Committee, sat on the subcommittee that worked on the conservation programs. He certainly, better than anyone, understands these programs and how successful they have been. Before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, only about a third of farmers that wanted to participate in conservation programs were able to do so. The $20 billion in IRA money that went to Climate Smart Ag plussed up existing programs like CSP and EQIP that farmers want to be a part of. So I think that's a tremendous success story. We've expanded the opportunity for more farmers to enroll in that. It's a win-win scenario. It's building resiliency, it's building soil health, it's making for a more resilient food and ag system in the United States, and it's meeting these emerging markets. That's where I think we will continue to go with Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. I don't think that we need to address this through regulatory requirements or systems, because we're making progress with this type of voluntary approach.
We're going to move to audience questions in just a bit, but I did want to ask one question about biofuels before we do. What is your vision for what the next administration should be doing on that front? Rod, do you want to start?
Sure. So this is topics near and dear to my heart, because I just came from EPA that administers the renewable fuel standard, just left there last month. And I'm going to repeat a couple things I said in my opening statement, but I think it's worth acknowledging, which is that under the prior administration, the renewable fuel standard was really in a tough spot. Small refinery exemptions were being issued to the tune of 4 billion gallons that undercut the volumes that had been established. Really, all that does is hurt American corn and soybean farmers, row crop farmers that are growing for those markets. In 2021, there were no volumes set at all, which just creates tremendous uncertainty for the marketplace. The Biden-Harris administration committed from the very beginning that getting the RFS back on track was a really key priority. We made good on that. We have, the administration finalized the largest ever volumes in the history of the program across all categories, including 15 billion gallons of conventional ethanol. And by the way, have issued no small refinery exemptions. I realize that's being challenged in court. I understand that. But as a policy matter, not issuing those exemptions means that those volumes are held intact, and it's a market that farmers can depend on. And there is room for growth. The Inflation Reduction Act includes tax credits for clean fuels and sustainable aviation fuel that will help to continue to grow these opportunities. And I know there's a lot of talk about electric vehicles and sort of the debate around the future of what does on-road transportation look like. That's also happening in the private sector. The auto manufacturers are talking about those kinds of investments, but if we can continue to look for new markets, even if on-road liquid fuels plateau, there are still future opportunities for farmers as long as the government can help come alongside and be a partner in that work. I think the Biden-Harris administration has been completely committed to this in a way that the Trump administration really left farmers in the lurch and left too much uncertainty.
As a farmer, I'll tell you, the biofuels industry has been it's revitalized rural America. I look at those in the biofuel space that took the risk, that invested in these plants and spread them throughout the country. That has been done more to help farmers' profitability and allowing them to reinvest into their farms. So we're going to have a lot of alignment here. Reinvest in their farms to increase their productivity. A lot of people always talked about, well, it's taking food away from, it's taking corn away from being used for human consumption and other things. There is no food versus fuel argument. All you use is a starch anyway. But the reality is we need to be E15, we need to be probably E20, maybe even E30. A lot of vehicles can burn this today, but the electric vehicle mandates have been pretty substantially hurting the industry somewhat, and investing in those who want to invest in biofuels plants because they don't know what the future looks like. I think it's clear to say that I believe in the future, our fuel will come from above the ground and not below the ground. And I think corn-based ethanol, the other crops are out there too. You're listening to a corn farmer now, so you know where my bias is. But the reality is it's a broad acre crop. It's produced along a lot of areas, but it's the rising tide that raises all ships. We need to see continued growth in the biofuel industry, and I think we can do a lot more. And I'll tell you this, the Trump administration has been very supportive, and I think you'll find them to be very more supportive in the future.
You both talked about this divide between rural and urban America, and obviously USDA has a very broad mandate. Are there any other policies that you want to emphasize that touch rural America that are important to you and the campaigns you're advising?
Well, I mentioned a few of these things in my opening comments, but farmers do not exist in a vacuum. Most of our food is grown in rural America for sure, but they're surrounded by small towns and communities that make up a thriving part of the country. And I do think it's critically important, and that's why USDA Rural Development exists and other aspects of the federal government to help invest in those kinds of places. There's been underinvestment for many, many years that we're now beginning to see a shift. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Plan began to direct resources into rural communities in a way that we haven't seen in a long, long time. And I mentioned some of them in my opening comments: rural electrification, clean water. I went with, again, just in my personal, I'm going to say this as not as a former EPA employee, but I went out with Administrator Regan to some places that didn't have clean drinking water, didn't have wastewater infrastructure, and for the first time, perhaps ever, we're trying to touch some of those communities that need those resources. So absolutely, I think the bulk of this conversation is about the farm economy, but these are also rural places that deserve these types of investments, and the Biden-Harris administration has put the money where the mouth is and actually begun to really resource those things.
I think one of the things we hear oftentimes in conversations amongst the people in this room and around the country is rural broadband. Mm-hmm. Something it seems like we've been trying to solve for 20 years. And of course it gets faster as we go, but the reality is I don't know what the number is that the Biden-Harris administration has run through USDA on broadband expansion around the country. But from what I'm hearing, there's a number of articles lately that has said really not much has happened yet. And I guess I'd like to get an explanation of why we're not seeing more broadband exposure across rural areas. I can tell you it's critically important because any farm operation, anyone that lives in rural America, you're at a severe disadvantage, whether it's your children's linkage to the internet and what they do at school to the way the farm operates today. Everything we have on our farm is connected, whether it's grain silos, whether it's irrigation systems, tractors, whatever it may be. We have to have that broadband, but we're not seeing that much movement over the past 4 years and really getting it deployed. I know the money's there, it's been pushed out there, but we haven't seen deployment and execution.
Okay, well, I think we are going to open this up. We have questions coming in online, and I think we will also be taking questions from the audience. So maybe we can start off with a few in the room, and I believe someone is going to come around with a microphone. Just give it a minute. And could you identify yourself when you ask your question?
Sure. My name's Harry Huntley with the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. We heard a little bit so far about how each of the previous administrations creatively used the Commodity Credit Corporation funds, and I think we know there's a lot of kind of normal stuff that those CCC funds go to, but I'd be interested to hear from each of you what you think the next administration should do, maybe a little out of the ordinary with the CCC, or if they should, if you support the legislation that's been brought forward to kind of curtail those new ideas.
Kip, do you want to start? Or Rod?
I'm happy to start. To answer the second part of your question, no, I think hamstringing the USDA Secretary of Agriculture from deploying those funds is a bad idea. Just as I mentioned about it, last year the Regional Ag Promotion Program, more than $1 billion to try to help open up these new markets. These are ways in which these dollars are intended to help strengthen markets and opportunities for American farmers. Clearly, some of the climate smart ag projects and whatnot are coming for these are new markets, new opportunities for farmers. I think hamstringing USDA around that is not the correct way to go. I realize that's what the House Ag Committee has passed, but these are the kinds of opportunities that I think are available to the next administration if we allow it.
Like whether you're at a bank, there's certain limits that a loan officer has and how he can loan money out, or with the guidelines you have with your own children, there have to be limits. And I think allowing the secretary to have the limits that they have today and not having congressional oversight, saying yes or no on this, not having that discussion is not good for USDA, not good for our country, especially when I look at the Thrifty Food Plan, as I said, $238 billion. All the more reason why we need to have more oversight.
Maybe we could take a couple more questions from the room and then do some of the online ones. I think our microphone is working its way.
Hello. I'm in the back of the room. My name's Tim Burek. I'm a farmer from Iowa. I flew 1,000 miles to be here today. And I'm going to start by comments rather than questions. I'm a little disgusted with the whole thing I've heard here. I live in the reality world, and I appreciate your dialogue, but I just feel that it's the same old stuff and the solutions. And I'm going to go down a list of things I made notes on. I'm going to start with EQIP. You're absolutely right, Ambassador. I've applied for EQIP 3 times. I've still yet to receive a penny. I do the no-till, I do the cover crops. I've applied for the 4th time. They said the chances are you won't get it, but it's for the 25 year now. So it sounds good, it doesn't get there. Let's talk about ethanol. Both of the administrations have just been really hard on ethanol. Trump, with the first EPA administrator with the SREs, took 5 billion gallons of demand away. And then we come forward and then trying under the Biden administration, trying to get ethanol in place, getting the RFS up to date. And you're right, E15 nationwide would be great. Brazil just announced this week that they're going to go to 100% ethanol in hybrid cars. Ford's going to build them. Why can't we do that here? We focus on electric. Doesn't work in rural America at all. Can't get anywhere. So crop insurance, let's talk about that. As that ratchets down next year, the safety net of crop insurance is not going to be good at all. We need new farm policy. We'll probably be looking at $4.50 crop insurance protection when my cost is above that, maybe $4, depending on how big the crop is. China has no corn on the books this year of a crop we're growing now, a record crop. They have none bought for the first time since the early 90s. And why is that? Well, that's because of the tariffs. We have so aggravated our #1 customer over the years, and I hear the arguments why. But I lived at the time when the first tariffs were announced, and between May 1st, and it was either 18 or 19, May 1st and August 1st, the value of my hogs, corn, and beans dropped $2 million in 3 months. But my bank did not reduce my loan by $2 million in 3 months. And the money that was Trump said he supposedly paid out covered about 10% of that. It just is a complete disaster. And the more I hear about tariffs, the more nervous I get. Rod, I agree with you on that. It is a scary time. And I don't know what you're thinking about in terms of the ability to counter that, but we've got to come up with something different. If we're going to have tariffs, we have got to have a different method. So let's go back to our exports. Brazil has expanded 5.4% per year over the last 20 years in row crop production. That's why they're taking over soybeans. They were #1 in corn last year. If we want to regain our export markets, we need to have farm policy that gets us to market clearing levels. We need a safety level and then a market clearing policy that finally shuts them down so that they don't expand at 5.4%. And we've actually reached the price this year, and my Brazilian friends tell me they're done expanding.
Thank you so much. Maybe you could both respond to that question about tariffs and if that gives other countries an opportunity to occupy some of that market space.
Well, yeah, and Tim, first of all, Tim, thank you for flying out here and being here. Tim and other farmer leaders give of a tremendous amount of their personal time, step away from the farm to come to DC. I see several faces around the room to participate in these conversations. It is needed, so thank you for being here. A couple different issues. On the tariff issue, you're absolutely right. If we continue to, particularly if we have additional tariffs going forward, it is an opportunity for other farmers in other parts of the world to come in and take those markets. That is a real risk, and it is what has happened in the last number of years since the original Trump tariffs. That is a real risk, and I think it could get worse. In terms of renewable fuels and ethanol, E15, totally agree. Administrator Regan at EPA, the Biden-Harris administration, for the last 3 years issued summer emergency waivers to make sure that there was uninterrupted sale of E15 so that we can continue to expand ethanol consumption. There are more stations around the country now selling E15, and we're at the highest ethanol blend rate in the history of the program, in the history of RFS. So I think the Biden-Harris administration has tried to remain committed to this. this and in a way that is sustainable. So certainly I think there's no disagreement there.
Yeah, to address your trade issues on tariffs, I mean, there's more reason than tariffs is why we're seeing the loss of sales into China. I mean, it's the strength of the U.S. dollar against the yuan. It's you can look at their economies in a collapse right now. So there's a number of reasons there. Then I can go even further. You know, they bought a company called Syngenta. We're all familiar with Syngenta. Now they have access to GM crops in China. They produce a lot of acres. Just think about if they plant GM crops on more of their acres, just a 10% increase, and they don't need us anymore. So there's a lot of threats that are beyond tariffs or the fear of tariffs that has changed our market in China. The other thing I'll say is this, and Tim, thank you for being here and thanks for your questions, and I'm glad you're pointed. We as Americans need to continue to innovate. You heard me say that I don't know how many times. And it's value-add opportunities. Tom Dorr used to tell me this 20 years ago. He says, we got to get on a pathway to more innovation, more value-add in agriculture. Now, we think we're there today. There's not. We can go further. But we really need to be selling more in terms of value-add. If we're going to compete in a commodity market, I've been all over Brazil, I've been all over Argentina over the years. They're just basic commodity producers. Not just, they're our commodity producers. They got a lot of Chinese investment down there to make sure those commodities get to the ports and on into China. Hopefully we don't have them owning ports here in the United States, but the reality is they're going to continue to produce that. We need to go the route of incentivizing and making sure that we have value-add opportunities here in the United States to sell our products abroad.
This is sort of a related question that came in online, which is how would candidates seek foreign market access and strengthen ag exports without engaging in a trade war?
Repeat that again.
How would candidates seek foreign market access and strengthen ag exports without engaging in a trade war?
Well, we shouldn't engage in a trade war for starters. It's looking at some of the bilateral conversations that have been happening over the last several years. I talked about some of them: Japan, Mexico, looking at Latin America, looking at Africa, some of these emerging markets. Investing in those relationships. And look, the farmers are doing it too. Some of these trade promotion boards and programs that farmers are going overseas, I've talked to them after they come back from trade missions. These are investments and conversations that have been happening for years. We have to do everything we can to not undermine that work, to make sure that we are going to be good trade partners with these countries. And also addressing non-tariff barriers. The USDA under the Biden-Harris administration challenging Mexico's GMO ban on GMO corn as not science-based. We've been aggressive on that, and I think there's supposed to be a ruling pretty soon. We have to stand up in those types of situations and push back and defend American farmers, and I think that Vice President Harris will absolutely do that if elected.
Yeah, my comment would be that, like I said, there's a lot on the table when you come into these trade negotiations, and no one knows it better than what Lighthizer or Greg Dow did when they're in the USTR. But I had this example last week. I had a meeting in Indianapolis, a company that produces a chemical that is used for a lot of corn acres going forward in the future in the United States. They're the only producer in the United States because no one wants to build a plant because of EPA regulations. So you have China has 2 or 3 companies that are producing this product, highly subsidized, trying to take out the U.S. company. I know it's an ITC issue, but the reality is this is the unfair practices that take place, which is going to create a trade war that if we don't get them figured out sooner than later. So let's remember there's more than just the trade here. It's the ITC issues. It's making sure that American manufacturers, American workers have a place to go to work and make a good income. Otherwise, we could just export everything into China and let them produce it there.
Rod, a question that has come in for you. Oh, sorry, Kip. Would a Trump USDA prioritize the production of a domestic fertilizer?
Why didn't they?
Would a future Trump administration?
We need to.
And what would that look like?
I mean, let's face it. We have the natural gas supplies in the United States to produce nitrogen fertilizer. We're not going to produce potassium because we don't have it here in this country. It's in Canada. Phosphates could be, increased, but nitrogen is something we can produce with natural gas. We're still buying nitrogen from Russia. How do you feel about that? I don't feel very good about it, but because it's used to produce food, it's not on the sanction list. There is no reason for us to buy nitrogen from Russia. We have clean plants. We're seeing new blue and green production plants come to the United States, but we need to make sure we have more of them to make sure we have that basic building block to produce crops in this country. I mean, you can look at the world in charts and you look at how nitrogen production goes up and human population goes right up with it parallel. Why would we want to allow ourselves to be compromised by a country like Russia on nitrogen?
Let's do a few more questions from inside the room.
Hi, right over here. Hello, John Torres with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. Thanks for being here today. My question is around domestic regulatory reform. Ambassador, you talked about in your opening statements the need for the United States to invest in innovation. One of the things that we're seeing from whether they're large multinational corporations or small startup companies in the biotech space and food, agriculture, and environment is the regulatory environment here in the United States. EPA, USDA, FDA, and others provide significant barriers to market to bring new innovation to farmers or other industrial producers here in the United States, while countries like Canada have really fast-tracked biotech approvals in their country. South America is doing the same. We're worried about, you've already talked about China. How do we address the regulatory barriers around innovation, particularly in biotechnology in this country? And Rod, to your credit, we've worked with EPA on some regulatory issues, so we know work's being done. But what we're hearing from the private sector is not enough is being done soon enough, and innovation is bleeding outside of the borders of the United States to our competitors. So how do we address those regulatory challenges?
You're right. I've sort of had a front seat to some of this conversation at EPA, and there's a couple of issues that are at hand. One is the Biden-Harris administration did have an executive order and an interagency process to look at improving the regulatory framework. The light is so bright I can barely see you. Improving the regulatory framework around biotech products, and that has had a serious level of commitment from senior leadership, including in the White House, to figure out how we can make these improvements going forward and really streamline that process. I completely agree. Innovation in this space is critical to long-term sustainability and productivity of U.S. agriculture. And so the work that you're doing at Bio, I think is critically important, right? The second challenge, which perhaps is not as well understood, is that we have regulatory agencies, particularly EPA, and particularly the division that a lot of this work happens, that is starved for resources and has been now for a number of years. The Office of Pesticide Programs that oversees both the chemical and genetic approval process for these products has been flat for 10 years. I've talked to the folks, the dedicated career staff, brilliant, best in the world, but they don't have the resources from Congress that they need to get this work done. And until Congress steps up, and I can say this more freely now that I'm on the outside, steps up and funds the agency and that office at the level that it needs to be, we are going to lag behind. And so that should be a bipartisan issue. It should be something that everyone stacks hands and works with the appropriators to make sure that they're made whole, because we're not cutting it right now in terms of those resources.
Well, I think you heard me say earlier, the administrator under Trump, he was given clear orders that for every one regulation you want to bring on, 2 need to go away. And I look at the ability to us to craft innovations to get them to the marketplace. I think EPA, it's 17 years to get a new chemical to the market, a new molecule to the marketplace. We lack the tools or the resources we need on the farm to deal with the different weeds, insects, and diseases that we deal with. It's because EPA is moving so slowly. Whether it's a funding issue, whether it's a workforce issue, I'm not sure. But the reality is we got so many regulations that are in the way. The government is getting in the way of us bringing innovation forward in our country. It seems like this oversight, strict oversight, has continued to grow over time, and it's not allowing us to innovate the way we need to the level we need to, at the velocity we need to.
Okay, next question. Yes.
A question to Gary Bays, an attorney here in town and farmer in Illinois. And we're harvesting corn this morning at 284 average bushel per acre. And that's one of our problems. We grow too much. But to EPA, what are you doing on CRISPR-Cas9 in terms of getting the regulations out of the way? And to Kip, WOTUS, would you try to change the WOTUS rule that's been changed back, that it's haunting agriculture with our streams? So 2 questions.
And maybe you could explain a little bit of what CRISPR is for the uninitiated.
Yes, right. Genetic engineering technology that is sort of the new wave, the next generation, rather than genetic. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I can do my best to explain this to the audience. But basically accelerating plant breeding in a way that is not taking transgenic genes, right? So that's, as I mentioned before, that review and approval, it's the biotech framework between FDA, USDA, and EPA. The team that is working on that within EPA, as I said, is short-staffed, is resource-constrained, but they are looking at ways in which we can try to accelerate that. And are there areas in which we can perhaps deregulate a bit and looking at opportunities for if we can assess the safety of certain traits and make a determination up front, perhaps that can accelerate some of the timelines. I think that's a completely valid and fair conversation. I do want to just take 1 second on WOTUS, if that's okay, because I worked on that too. And I would say over a number of years, this has been a really challenging area, and it's because the hydrologic system in the United States is complicated, and where you draw the line between what's federally regulated and what's not is not an easy question. The Obama WOTUS rule was overturned by federal courts. The Trump WOTUS rule was overturned by federal courts.
And should we just say that's waters of
the
United
States? Sorry.
Just in case
I've been
anyone
trying
in this
to
room
avoid
doesn't know.
acronyms. Basically this is wetland. Which waters are regulated federally and which are not. It's very important to farmers and landowners, and I completely agree. I worked on this my whole career. Federal courts have had their say, and the prior two rules from both the Democrat and Republican administration were overturned. The Biden-Harris administration did what they could, we could, to try to find a middle ground approach that codified exemptions for farmers, including things like prior converted cropland, certain ditches, et cetera, that would not be jurisdictional. That's still pending in court, and we will find out soon the fate of that. And right now, half the states are implementing one set of rules and half the other. That's unsustainable. At the end of the day, farmers and landowners need a predictable, steady state for years to come so that we know the rules, and that's to everyone's benefit. So I think that's the commitment that you would have from Vice President Harris, is to look at a pragmatic, durable solution.
Gary, so just my brief comments on WOTUS is that I got a friend that's a farmer in California, member of Congress actually.
Congressman Duarte.
And they've paid some pretty substantial attorney's fees and fines over WOTUS. To me, it's a taking of private property. I mean, like I said, there's no one that's a better environmentalist and steward of the land than the farmer. But yet when you have government, you have the threat of government, whether it's an Endangered Species Act, whether it's WOTUS, that's constantly breathing over our shoulder. You're going to discourage young people from getting into the business. You're going to discourage and make us feel that we're living under the constant threat of being taken to court by the federal government. These different issues need to be dealt with. If we're going to encourage innovation, bringing new people into the business. I know there's going to be an answer for this on WOTUS and the ESA, but the reality is these are bad policies that should never have been started. Now we're trying to deal with it like you have with the ESA, and there's no good way out of it.
Maybe another question from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Rich Kottmeyer, Michael Best. Question for both of you. Throw a hand grenade out there for you. Do we really want the private sector to use its investment capital to determine regulatory policy for rural America? I mean, we think about the private sector in rural America as more our private sector, agribusiness. But if we think about the private sector generally, it includes retail, financial services, which have been investing, and they tend to follow the consumer that tends to be unaware of what rural America does, how we farm, etc., leading to things like cage-free, no gestation crates, no pesticides ever, vertical farming, EV orientation that was exuberant, to put it that way. So are we really wanting the private sector who follows the consumer to determine our regulatory policy through their investment capital?
Well, prior to coming into government, I spent 7 years as president of a nonprofit called Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture, that brought together downstream food companies, retailers, upstream farmers, government, academia, everybody, to have a conversation around what is a pragmatic way to address sustainability, to send signals through the supply chain back to the farmer. It is critical that farmers be a part of those conversations. And I also think it's important for USDA to be a part of those conversations, which is exactly why programs like Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities that USDA is investing in help to send direction around what's fair game and what's not, what's agronomically viable and what's not. And I agree, sometimes the further you get from the farm, perhaps the closer to the consumer, that's often a less informed perspective, just to be honest. So we need to have experts at the table that are helping to write those guidelines and rules, and I personally think that is a role for USDA as well.
I would say we're going to have a lot of alignment on this. USDA playing a role in the standard setting, but let us figure out the value with the private sector. You know, I want the carrot, I don't want the stick. So that's why I say it's a private-public partnerships and trying to establish this.
Question from the online audience. We've talked a lot about trade, but could you each talk about how your candidate's tax policy would help farmers? Chris Clayton from DTN says, former President Trump referenced supporting agriculture through a wealth fund. How would that work? Or just generally speaking, could you talk a little bit about how the tax policies would help farmers?
Well, I think the Trump tax bill, if you look back to it, I mean, we moved the death tax per couple from like $6 to $7 million to today it's nearly $25 million. And if I think of land values today, and I think that of a farm that's operating at scale, $25 million really doesn't even get you very far. So I look at what he did in the tax bill then. We looked at, you know, we still have stepped up in basis. We know what the Harris administration is proposing today of taking away stepped up basis. We've heard comments on the unrealized net gains taxes. We're talking about increasing the tax on corporations from 20% to 28%. Some are wanting to go down to 15%. The Trump administration. We've got to make sure we have tax policy that allows these farms to continue in the future. Like I said, I really see this as probably the greatest risk to U.S. agriculture if the Harris administration, what they're wanting to do, the Harris-Biden administration at the time when they quoted it, would be devastating to U.S. agriculture, and I think will cease to exist the way we are today. We need to make sure we see permanence in the Trump tax legislation.
So I know this can often sound like a tired talking point, but it doesn't make it any less true, and that's that the Trump tax cuts from 2017, the vast majority of that benefit did go to the top 1% earners in the United States. That is not your average farmers across the country or rural residents across the country did not benefit in that way from the 2017 Trump tax cuts. If they were to be extended, the estimation is that the cost for another decade would be $4.6 trillion in terms of extending the Trump tax cuts. And to what end? To whose benefit? I certainly don't think it's average farmers and ranchers across the United States that are seeing the benefit of that. And in terms of estate tax and whatnot, you know, look, I'm not a tax expert by any means, but you know, basically, unless and until that farm is sold, we're not talking about an inheritance tax. Farmers are not taxed on inheritance. It's if it's sold. And those protections are still, those exemptions are still up to $14 million, even under the prior policy, which 99% of farms would not be affected, even under the prior rules. So we're really talking about 1% of farms, not average farmers across the country that would be impacted. So I just want to contextualize the conversation so we know who we're talking about and who we're not.
We have a question about Project 2025. Which our questioner says has called for eliminating the agricultural marketing and promotion, otherwise known as checkoff programs. How would either candidate feel about the checkoff programs for agricultural commodities? And broadly speaking, do you see any tension between USDA overseeing farmers and also advocating for promoting U.S. agriculture?
The checkoff programs are a tremendous success. We should not eliminate them. Vice President Harris would not eliminate them, and that's a pretty quick conversation.
You know, first of all, President Trump has no ties to Project 2025. Now, I know there's going to be skeptics in the room that say that, but the reality is he has no ties to Project 2025, period. They came up with their own policy, it got leaked out there. So the reality is he wants to do what's best for the farmers. And so I continue to stand behind him. And, you know, if it's the checkoff dollars that's going out to corn growers or soybean or whoever it may be, if I understand the question right, those will continue on. We hope it continues to grow the market share, whether it's dairy, whatever. We need to continue that going forward, but we need to hold them accountable. You know, I know one checkoff fund that's got over $150 million in its bank account right now. What are you doing with it?
Which one is that?
I'm not talking.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is we need to hold them accountable and make sure they're doing what they are supposed to do with those checkoff dollars.
Sir, oh.
Sorry. Helena Bottomiller-Evich with Food Fix. Thank you so much for taking my question. I have a general question and then a specific one to follow that's very related. I was hoping each of you could talk a little bit about each campaign's vision for tackling diet-related diseases and, you know, USDA programs. It's obviously related. Should those be leveraged further? And then specifically, I wanted to ask about when Senator Harris was running for president in 2020, during the primary, she was asked about the dietary guidelines and whether or not they should urge less consumption of meat as part of a broader sort of concern about climate change and whether we should, you know, insert sustainability into dietary guidelines. This has been a really hot topic, so I was hoping each campaign could also comment a little bit on that issue particularly. Thank you.
Well, certainly this was part of the, back to the dietary guidelines and just general overall public health was a huge part of the conversation around the White House conference. I'm very sure you were probably there. In terms of some of the national, it resulted in a national strategy that helped to work on some of these issues, things like increasing physical activity, some of the things that you talked about earlier. The Biden-Harris White House took time to publish an entire strategy that got into things like appropriate diets and also, and even some of the SNAP programs, there's public education, SNAP Ed and GusNIP that provide education to consumers around healthy choices. Those types of programs are incredibly important and effective and should be continued. So I think this has been a focus of the Biden-Harris administration that she would certainly carry forward. I am not familiar with any positions that Vice President Harris is advancing right now around meat consumption or not. I just think we need to make sure that these remain science-based conversations and folks' diets are very diverse in terms of needs. And I think we need to make sure that remains centered, but I am not familiar with the position that she's taking in that regard.
It's undeniable. Our health is directly connected to our nutrition, the food we consume. And I think this is something that's personal choice for people. But again, when we have that, now we have health care out there. We see the increase in childhood diabetes, type 2. We see other issues going on, but I know President Trump has made the comments in the last week about making sure children have a healthy diet. They have access to the foods they need to support their early development. And I think red meat is all a part of that. That's one of the best products we can consume, nutrient dense. But then these fruits and vegetables. So again, I think we can't deny food that we consume has an impact on our health.
I will say, most of us are old enough to remember that First Lady Michelle Obama waded into this a number of years ago and faced a lot of criticism. So at the end of the day, either our leaders have a role to play in helping to talk about healthy diets and physical activity, or they don't. I think that, quite frankly, it is a place that we can play in terms of encouraging these kinds of things.
Yep.
Yes. I'm Jerry Bowman with the American Dairy Science Association. My question is really for both campaigns. There's a lot of discussion about innovation and science, but what would both campaigns do to spark innovation, say at land-grant universities that help support industry?
Well, that's part of the discussion in the Farm Bill. We want to see increased funding for research and development, FAR, make sure that it's fully funded to do what it needs to do. We're falling behind. I mean, China spends nearly 10 times the amount that we do on research and development at the level they're at, and we need to spend more in the United States to make sure that we are producing the products we need to. But it comes down to public-private partnerships between the land-grant universities and some of these companies that are out here that can join in together with them to bring them the tools to accelerate that development.
This is probably an area of total agreement, and this is part of the Farm Bill conversation every 4 or 5 years. But and I don't think this is specific to the current platform of either campaign. I haven't seen any ag research discussions that are that specific. But it's critically important to the future of U.S. food and agriculture. The Farm Bill, I would, from a personal perspective, agree we should plus up those kinds of investments. That's the money that we're investing today. We're looking at 10, 15 or more years down the road that can pay dividends in terms of the competitiveness of American agriculture. So completely agree with Kip in that.
Jerry? Oh, wait, sorry. I think you might need a microphone. We have a microphone back here. Oh, back there? Okay.
Thank you. This is first to the ambassador. You made a statement in your opening in regards to no monopolies. I would suggest, I'm Joe Maxwell. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Farm Action. I'm a family farmer from Missouri, 4th generation. I would suggest you go to farmaction.us and look at the concentration data that's there. I asked a question for both individuals to kind of understand where the campaigns are. Talked about the trade deficit. It's just here a few weeks ago, they upped the number to over $40 billion. We did a report that indicated when it was estimated at $32.5 billion, that one of the leading factors was the fact that we are focused, I know both of you all are heavily focused on commodity crops, but in our report, we indicated that over the last 20 years, we've decreased the amount of specialty crop production in the United States by 20 to 90%, potatoes, tomatoes, oranges, apples. We've not heard a lot from either one of you today as it relates to how we can address, and Ambassador's been talking about fruits and vegetables, how we address that issue within the Farm Bill or in policy to be able to bring back that higher value food crop as compared to the lower value export feed crop of soybeans and corn. And what does the candidates have in plans to help feed us food crops? Thank you.
Very good question. You know, you don't have to drive up and down the valley in California and witness what's going on today. I got friends that are growers out there of a lot of specialty crops. The challenges they face in a Democrat-controlled state is access to water, which is probably one of their biggest issues, access to the technologies they need to control the pests that they have there. So that really challenged them. But now it comes down to, let's face it, legal migration, where they're not getting the workers. H-2A program works very well on addressing a lot of that. I think we need to accelerate the use of H-2As. It's a fully vetted program that producers can utilize. But right today, I think nearly 2/3 of our vegetables and fruits are imported from around the world somewhere now. This contributes to our trade deficit. So we need to do what we can. But I tell you what, I can't move Southern California. I don't think any of us can. But it's one of the greatest places in the world to produce the dollar volume that they do, but then the crops that they produce there as well. So today, many are moving to Colombia, Peru. We see that going on. Chinese are building a new port in Peru, I think maybe even be open by right now. We see air freight moving around. We need to make sure that we can produce these crops back in the United States, because if we don't figure out this legal migration issue, our crops are going to be picked on foreign lands by foreign hands instead of foreign hands in the United States of America, and produced under the standards we expect them to be produced under, using the products that we want to use to protect that crop.
So certainly would echo some of those comments. Let me go back to the first point about concentration. The Biden-Harris administration has been very interested and focused on this issue of concentration monopolies, certainly looking at the existing authorities around antitrust that could be pursued, but also investing in things like small and medium meat and poultry processing facilities, more than $500 million to help build up that, so that farmers and ranchers have more markets and access to markets beyond just the big players. I think that's part of the clear values and strategy that you can see from Vice President Harris. And then in terms of specialty crops, largely agree that we need to make sure that we're really supporting this industry across the United States. Some of that is Farm Bill programs, the types of safety net and crop insurance programs that should be available, conservation programs for specialty crops. The water issues are certainly of interest. I've talked to Secretary Karen Ross out in California, and the threat of what it means if some of those areas begin to dry up. It's partly why we got to invest in climate smart agriculture to make sure that we can actually begin to, to hold on to those production areas out west. And then to your point, the labor issues are front and center, and I know we disagree on this, but fundamentally, there's nothing that's coming from the Trump campaign that gives me any reassurance that that problem is going to get solved. In fact, I think it'll be exacerbated with the policies that President Trump is advancing right now on immigration and labor.
If you could each talk a little bit about this labor problem, how do you expand the guest worker program? How do you get that through a Congress that has had a lot of problems dealing with immigration, despite the fact that there has been bipartisan legislation on this issue?
Yeah, I think there's a blue ribbon panel that took place in Congress to really look at this issue and try to come up with some of the solutions. The reality is we do have an illegal immigration problem. I mean, you don't have to look very far to where we have these sanctuary cities where you're seeing the mass amount of crime that's occurring there. It's because we've left our borders open. People are coming in. We can't track them once they leave the Border Patrol. So we got to figure out a way to make sure that we can have fully vetted these people to come in. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's been a number of years, but I went to Nogales, and I actually walked into Mexico and walked across with people that were coming into the country to go to work and walk back out that same day. We need to make sure that takes place, but the illegal immigration has to be stopped.
And are you saying that needs to be resolved first before turning to guest worker visas?
I mean, that's very attainable today. I mean, I've got friends that are large potato producers, sweet potato producers, and they bring in H-2As from Mexico all the time. They have control of them, and then they go back. They're here, I think, 9 or 10 months at the most, and they go back home. Instead, under the Biden administration, they've actually increased our cost to access that H-2A program. We use them on our own farm because we just can't get the labor we need. But it's a good program. We need to make sure it's facilitated and can grow. But again, we need to support legal migration.
So, in absence of congressional leadership or political will, the Biden-Harris administration has tried to do what it can. And there's a USDA pilot program, the Farm Labor Stabilization Protection pilot program, to try to help connect farmers with labor. And this is, earnest efforts to try to solve the problem. But fundamentally, Congress has got to find the will to address this. This is true for overall immigration reform and also specific for farm labor issues. And we have solutions on the table. There have been bipartisan pieces of legislation over the last several years that have had, viable, I think, proposals to try to help solve this. And, I think largely our friends on the right have torpedoed that because they don't really want to solve the problem. It's a convenient political talking point. And look, Vice President Harris is also committed to securing the border. That has been part of her message all along, which is that we have to secure the border and come up with better pathways to citizenship and also just making sure that we can meet these labor needs. That has to happen comprehensively. And this is not rocket science. There are proposals in Congress that would get us there today. We need to pass them.
In the back.
Robert Chelland, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, a general farm organization. 2 questions. One is, what would be preferable, an extension of the Farm Bill for 1 year, or somehow for Congress to deliver a Farm Bill post-election to the President?
Sooner is better, but this is Rod speaking. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of any campaign or candidate other than to say I think American agriculture wants Congress to get this done as quickly as possible. If that's not possible, then an extension certainly helps bring that certainty. But we need Congress to get the job done.
I'm going to be with Rod on this. The sooner the better. This conversation taking place, if we would happen to have a Biden-Walz administration, this conversation next year doesn't look very good when you come out into rural America because we haven't solved it yet. We're going to deal with several years of surplus here. We're going to deal with several years of lower farm income, all because of lack of trade under the Biden-Harris administration. So the sooner we can get a bill done that addresses our issues today, the better off we'll be.
Thank you. Second question. We in Colorado Colorado are really good at producing water, and we put it in the Colorado River, and 9 states downstream and 1 other country really need it. What role does the federal government have in trying to mediate downstream interest, upstream interest, energy versus agriculture, tourism, that whole Gordian's knot?
Well, certainly, as you know, states and localities typically are in the driver's seat around water use policy, not the federal government. But to your point, there can be a role. Just last month, USDA announced a $400 million investment with 18 irrigation districts across 12 states to try to help address this. The federal government can be a partner in bringing states together to try to convene solutions, and I think that's what the Biden-Harris administration has been working to do. Someone doesn't like what I'm saying. But even just that program that Secretary Vilsack just announced, it estimated that it'll conserve 50,000 acre feet of water use across 250,000 acres of irrigated land. We've got to get creative, and we need federal state partnerships to get us there. But that's just a recent example from a month ago.
No, Rod, actually, I like what you said, because this is where we need to go on Western water law. It's much different than what we have here in the eastern part of the country, right? But it's going to take that involvement of the federal government to make sure it's right. Where I get really troubled with this is how much water, fresh water, we release into the Pacific Ocean off the west coast of the United States. This is where I think we could do a lot more work in creating reservoirs. Instead, we're talking about taking them out. The reality is we would increase our volume of fresh water if we would just invest back in some of this infrastructure to make sure we can shore up this water. If we're going to continue to grow our population, we're going to increase our demand for food, we need to capture that fresh water.
Hello, I have a question on federal crop insurance. I'm Jim Callan. I'm an ag government relations consultant. You both mentioned its importance, as have others in the room. Wondering if you had a chance to look at Senator Hoeven's bill, which is supported by pretty much every major commodity group in the United States and many state organizations. All of it's made its way into Senator Bozeman's framework. Part of it's made its way into Chairman Thompson's bill, and part of it's made its way into Senator Stabenow's framework. And it would basically make crop insurance more affordable at higher levels. Wondering if you have some comments on it.
Jim, I haven't read that specific piece of legislation, but just fundamentally say we need more crop insurance tools, not fewer. They need to be more affordable to farmers. It's really the foundation of our safety net in the United States, and I'm happy, interested to read the legislation.
Anything that would get rid of, obviously we did crop insurance because we want to get rid of disaster payments, right? That's why we established it, that's why it's out there. We're still making disaster payments, though, for some reason. But if we would have the ability to raise the level of insurance that we have, let's face it, every farm operation is different around the United States. No two are alike. So having the ability to have that flexibility makes a lot of sense. And if Senator Bozeman is supporting it, I would too.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions from the audience. Yes, sir, in the back there.
Yes, I'm Richard Siegel. I was a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and in the Reagan administration under Secretary Jack Block and Secretary Dick Ling, I was proud to be a political appointee. One thing that concerns me, I was in the department in that capacity for 6 years, worked every day with career people who took my instruction, who took my guidance, because I was following the playbook of Secretary Block, Secretary Ling, and President Reagan, and I felt that I was getting good performance from the career people. Now, one of the signature issues of former President Trump is that he wants to replace thousands of career employees. I wonder how this would affect the Department of Agriculture, which has 100,000 such employees. And all of the subject matter in the panel today has concerned policy, new initiatives, new programs. All of this depends on the worker bees in the Department of Agriculture, and I'm concerned about the lack of continuity and potential chaos of the personnel approach that former President Trump has been speaking about.
Kip,
Well, I guess that's for me, huh?
that's for you.
I have thoughts.
You know, I haven't heard anything mentioned about President Trump and what he's wanting to do with the federal agencies. There's no question that I think all of us as taxpayers should make sure we're watchful of how big federal agencies get. You know, let's face it, we've came to a world today where we can manage a lot more with the computer resources we have and access to technology that we have. So do we need as many people? I can't answer that question today. I don't know. But the reality is, I think we need to have a watchful eye on how big we allow government to be. That would be my answer to your question. As far as what President Trump wants to do, I haven't heard that comment at all.
I have heard some of this concern with respect to former President Trump's goals for federal employees across all agencies, not just USDA, and it is concerning. I just worked the last 3 years at EPA, and alongside just as the experience you were describing, every day I'd show up and work alongside career employees that were incredibly committed to the job, some of the best experts not just in the country but in the world on these subjects, and we need to allow them to do their jobs without politicizing that. And I do have a concern that if former President Trump wants to sort of come in and mess with that system, or perhaps peel back the federal workforce in a way that could be detrimental to all this important work that's going on, it is a concern to me, and I appreciate you mentioning it.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Good afternoon. Jack Long with the National Association of Weakers. Thank you both for being here today. So my question is, we mentioned a little bit about waters in the Pacific Northwest, but as we see a strong demand for expanding these export markets, there are concerns with our current transportation systems on both sides of the aisle. Rail closures, strikes, potential talks about dam breachments on the PNW, and CARB's ban on locomotives are all examples of damaging an efficient transportation industry for agriculture. I'm curious as to what you think each of your party's candidate is proposing to promote ag transportation in the United States and further strengthen these tools for export markets.
It's a great question. When I was working at the National Corn Growers, part of my portfolio was transportation policy. Went out to the locks and dams and along the Mississippi River in the Midwest. It's such a key piece of infrastructure, both for getting crops to market, but also getting inputs up the river to farmers. Same was true in the Pacific Northwest, getting those commodities out to reach markets. The bipartisan infrastructure law was the largest investment in generations that the Biden-Harris administration championed and led, and that is going to have an impact for many years to come in terms of these types of investments, both in terms of rail and river and highways. That is critical to getting these goods to market, and I think that's an important outcome of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Fortunately, the word bipartisan, it did have Republican and Democratic support, but it was President Biden and Vice President Harris that got that done, and I think that will yield benefits for years to come for the U.S. ag sector. And the work's not done. Those types of things need to continue to happen going forward.
Yeah, so my response to that is I have no guidance from the campaign. Like I said, I am only talking on what President Trump did when he was in office between 2016 and 20. So I can't answer that question, but I think it's clear to say President Trump understands the critical importance of infrastructure. I mean, when you look at the United States, we have 14,800 miles of navigable waterways in the United States. Our locks and dams are crumbling. Our bridges are falling apart, and this isn't because of any one administration. This is because of, over time, we've just allowed money to go other directions when we should be investing in infrastructure. If we're going to remain competitive in that global trade sphere, it's time we reinvest in making sure our locks and dams, our ports, our rail lines, our roads are all sufficient to move the amount of crops that we want, or dairy products, beef products, anything from the agriculture centers of the U.S. to the export markets and get them abroad. That's the only way we remain competitive there.
And we're just going to wrap it up with a couple of closing comments. Kip, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think it's clear to say, you can tell I'm bullish agriculture as long as it's President Trump at the helm come 2025. But I want to share a little story. I was with the president back on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania. I met with him about 20 minutes before he went up on stage, and we had a conversation about agriculture. And he looked at me as I started to walk out of the room, and he grabbed my arm again. He said, "Wait a second." He said, "Let's make agriculture great again." So I think there's a real commitment by the president to make sure that we make agriculture great again. But one thing I noticed when he went out on stage, and obviously we can all recall the flag in the background and watching that shot that he was hit with, we knew it could have been a lot worse than that. But the reality is, the president got up, and when he looked out the crowd, they applauded. They started chanting USA, USA. But when he stood up, that showed instinctual courage. That's a sign of somebody that will not back down for a foreign adversary. It's also the sign of somebody who wants to lead a nation, will take the steps they need to make sure we have the right policy in place to make sure America remains first. So you've heard me talk a lot about critical supply chains, making sure that we invest in infrastructure, making sure we invest in innovation. He knows this more than anybody. Our food security is tied to our national security. President Trump wants to make sure our food system and agriculture is the strongest in the world to make sure we may remain in that power. I can tell you there's millions of farms around the United States that are right now very concerned. They're concerned about the tax law changes that could occur. They're worried about regulations. They continue to grow. At the same time, they know that their consumers are paying more for food today. So all I can say is, and Newt Gingrich says this to me often, this is the most important election in our lifetime, and maybe even in our nation's. I hope you can go out today and in the future when early voting opens up and vote for President Trump. Thank you.
So just take a quick point of personal privilege. I just want to say, Ambassador, that day in Butler, Pennsylvania, was at my house with actually some friends from the Senate Ag Committee. Ironically, we were sitting around when the news broke about that incident, and just were glued to the television for several hours and saw you coming on and talking about your experience there. And I just want to say, first of all, so glad that you're safe, so glad that President Trump was safe, and it's certainly a harrowing thing. There's no place for political violence in this country. It was reassuring to see your comments on television that day. In terms of this upcoming election, this, as I've said before, this is really a choice between certainty and chaos when it comes to foreign policy. We have lived through the prior 4 years of the Trump administration where there was tremendous uncertainty around trade, around labor, around renewable fuels, around our commitment to being global leaders in terms of climate-smart agriculture and conservation. Vice President Harris and Governor Walz are tremendously committed to working alongside U.S. farmers and ranchers across this country to make sure that we continue to lead the world in terms of food production. I hear President Trump talking so often about America in decline, and we need to make America is already great, and I think our food and ag system, our farmers and ranchers, are the best in the world, and we need to make sure that we are investing in them and supporting them and coming alongside them to make sure that we can continue to meet the moment. And I believe that Vice President Harris and Governor Walz are fully on board to do that, and I look forward to voting for them and electing them in November. Thank you for your time.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Kristina and Kip and Rod, for sharing your many insights with us today. I would also like to thank each of you in the audience, both here in the room and online, for joining us and submitting your many wonderful questions. We appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback, as I mentioned before, so please take a moment to share comments about today's session in the brief survey that you will receive in the next day or so. We will also provide information in the email about additional ways to engage with us at Farm Foundation, such as becoming a friend of Farm Foundation or by donating to support our many programs. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities. So we are so grateful for your support. And with that, we will now conclude the forum and end the live stream. But before we adjourn, I want to invite each of you to join us for a reception that we'll be holding just next door. This wall is going to open, and we'll have food and beverages back there. I've been instructed to make sure you know that you should have each received a drink ticket, and if you did not, I wanted the Farm Foundation staff to all raise their hands. You can find a Farm Foundation staff person to get your drinks ticket. And before we do that, I wanted to give a shout out to our chairman, Dan Bossy, who I believe is sitting over there. Raise your hand. Thank you for joining us today, Dan. And invite you to engage with him and with each other. Reach out to Farm Foundation if we can help you connect. But before we go and enjoy the reception, please join me one more time in thanking our wonderful panel.